It's demoralizing to see oppressive laws from the dark days of apartheid continue to divide present-day South Africans by race. Laws that were supposedly repealed back in the 1990s by leaders who devoted their lives and freedom to a liberation cause. To this day, South Africa is still divided by visible barriers that segregated citizens in such a way that skin color determines the quality of life, employment opportunities, and wealth. Apartheid's racial, class, educational, and economic factions still categorize the nation decades after Mandela's release. Following the formal demise of the apartheid regime with the country's first all-race election, it appears that inequality has only worsened, as evidenced in multiple facets of the country's development. Post-apartheid stories. In a recent report by the World Bank, South Africa was labeled as one of the world's most unequal countries. With a population that is over 75% black and only 9% white after over 25 years post-apartheid, it is puzzling to find white people make up well over 70% of top management positions in the private sector. The heterogeneous blend of black and white partitions cities within South Africa empathetically in a society where 10% of the population controls more than 80% of the wealth. The wealthy residents, mostly whites, reside in deluxe suburbs where upper-class and luxurious residencies are aesthetically littered with uninterrupted access to basic services. According to a University of Washington article titled "Informal Housing, Poverty, and Apartheid Legacies in South Africa," the number of white South Africans earning more than $60,000 per year is 20 times greater than the number of black South Africans. Across the country, large groups of black South Africans continue to live in townships and informal settlements, working multiple jobs for pitiful wages. For black people and their children, access to better education and healthcare is limited, and there are few options for moving out of townships. Education has been poor in black communities, and unemployment rates have reached 33%, the highest in the country's history and one of the highest in the world.
It's really difficult to catch the inequality that exists in South Africa. We're the most unequal country on the planet. It also exists in higher education.
In April 1994, South Africans of all races cast ballots in the country's first democratic elections, electing Nelson Mandela as the country's first black president. Despite the fact that much work remained to be done to improve the lives of all South Africans, the barbaric apartheid regime appeared to be peacefully coming to an end. Hope for a new South Africa, a modern-day integrated, non-racial, and free society for all was expected. This has not been the case, as racial segregation appears to be deeply embedded in the fabric of South African cities and has yet to be eradicated. This is due, in part, to the fact that while apartheid was the pinnacle of South Africa's racial divides, it was not the start of them. The narrative begins very early in the 1800s, when the British constructed a system of railroads that transformed the region's economy into one that largely marginalized the black South Africans. Segregation rooted deep in history. South Africa had racial segregation long before the 20th century. White settlers had long regarded black South Africans as a resource that could be used to transform the country from a rural to an industrial civilization, beginning with Dutch settlers in the 17th century who relied on slave labor to build South Africa. South Africa abolished slavery in 1863, as the country was on the verge of gold and diamond discoveries, which represented lucrative exploitation opportunities for white-owned mining companies that employed and exploited black laborers. All these mining corporations effectively enslaved black miners, while amassing vast fortunes from the diamonds and gold they extracted. To subdue black workers, the white miners, like the Dutch slave owners, resorted to intimidation and discrimination. They used the same strategies and laws that former slaveholders and British settlers used to control black workers. These 18th century laws required members of the black majority and other colored people to carry identity documents at all times and confine their mobility in certain areas. The laws also manipulated black settlement, forcibly relocating blacks to areas where their manpower would profit white settlers. In 1948, however, the National Party of South Africa, which was largely made up of colonialist descendants, instituted an official policy that increased racial segregation. Apartheid, which translates to apartness in Afrikaans, dominated South African life and kept the country's large black community under the thumb of a small white minority. It took decades of struggle to end this policy, which has affected every aspect of life in a country steeped in centuries of discrimination and racism. This system was based on the country's legacy of slavery and colonialism restructured as apartheid. It expanded on previous laws and passed 148 laws that aggressively enforced segregation even more because apartheid policy dictated all legislative action and response. The Group Areas Act of 1950 also established residential and business zones in cities for each racial group: natives, who were black, white, colored, and eventually Asian, with other races barred from living in or owning land in the so-called restricted areas. By the late 1950s, whites owned more than 80% of South Africa's land, and non-whites had to carry documents allowing them to enter restricted areas.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
Many townships, known as Bantustans, were established for blacks, coloreds, and Asians, and as of today, many of them have survived and thrived since apartheid, such as Soweto, despite remaining highly segregated. Bantustans were rural, underdeveloped economic territories set aside for black residents of South Africa and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, by South Africa's National Party administration as part of its policy. Owing to this, townships evolved into frontier towns, with a spine locked in colonial fashion. Blacks and whites remained largely separated, with the best and highest lands allocated to whites, who own mansions that sprawl in the wealthy northern suburbs, while black people were pushed to the south into townships. Similarly, cities within the country, such as Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, and others, have witnessed the same and are distressingly visible segregated. The end of the apartheid. By the end of the 1980s, white South Africans were growing dissatisfied with what they saw as South Africa's deteriorating global reputation. By that time, the country was facing sanctions and economic repercussions as multinational firms, public figures, and other government entities pressed the government to end discrimination. As the economy deteriorated, the government was at odds with anti-apartheid activists. The National Party was ultimately defeated in 1994, and Mandela was elected president of South Africa. A constitutional assembly was called, and South Africa implemented a new constitution that established a South Africa free of racial discrimination. The new government lifted bans on living policies, allowing a multitude of suppressed nationals to migrate to major cities in search of enhanced economic opportunities and access to basic services in urban centers. They hadn't anticipated the size of the influx of newcomers to cities, and millions of people migrated and settled in empty plots of land on the outskirts of major cities across the country, erecting shacks to create townships. Mandela and his new team promised and delivered over 1 million houses, as well as expanded water, electricity access, and other necessities to the previously disadvantaged. This goodwill was ultimately undone when an apartheid regime that had been so vehemently opposed was being inadvertently reinstated. The reaction has been a rush to these unplanned, new fringe areas, some of which are built on dangerous river banks but are typically formal, albeit small houses. As a result, cities' outskirts are flooded with new low-cost informal settlements and housing units, with little or no deliberate urban planning leading to integrated housing solutions. Workers, the middle and lower classes, as well as other social groups are typically concentrated in these informal settlements throughout Soweto, Alexandra, and other impoverished, crime-ridden black neighborhoods. The wealthy remain in the wealthy suburbs, while the poor are forced to relocate to the outskirts. Black middle classes, businesses, and political elite have emerged over the course of more than a quarter-century of democratic rule. Nonetheless, the majority of South Africans continue to suffer from a deplorable education system that prepares them for jobs, while townships built for blacks during apartheid keep them out of work. According to released reports, recent attempts by the now democratic government to erase the legacy of apartheid and colonialism have failed, with 3,500 adults owning more than the poorest 32 million people in the country of 60 million. Future prospects. From an outside perspective, South Africa is still a long way from being a multicultural society. Deep gullies of pain continue to divide the population, especially as black and white people primarily live separate lives with minimal interactions with each other. Nonetheless, the democratization of society is progressing steadily, particularly with attempts by a national commission to raise public awareness of apartheid with the goal of forgiveness. Going forward, it is vital that the intergenerational ramification is confronted and addressed, with sights on the Herculean task of rebuilding an apparently broken and still heavily segregated South Africa, even after years of abolishing apartheid. If you enjoyed this video and want more definitive information about trending issues in Africa, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, The New Africa Daily, your ultimate guide to staying informed on the latest and trending topics, facts, politics, and more in Africa.